I visited with Scott Stewart about a year ago. I was in the process of putting together a grant proposal. Those of us that work in the academic world are always chasing money in different realms. And narrowly, I put forth a USDA proposal that related to animal welfare issues. NIA was gracious enough to kind of partner, give a letter of support, right, when I was pursuing that grant. And I'm going to outline the purpose of that project, and then I'm going to put you all to work. Okay, that's the reason you're here. Somebody can lock the door if you don't want to work a little bit, but it'll be relatively harmless. We switched computers because I'm actually going to have you respond to some survey questions interactively here in a second. But I have two slides here just to overview the project, just to kind of get us all roughly on the same page. The title of our project here, you can read, is Beef and Dairy Cattle, Animal Welfare, Market Opportunities and Threats. The project itself is focused on the beef and dairy cattle industries. Today we're going to talk about some multiple species to keep it hopefully germane to the whole audience. And I'll get back to that a little bit more. You guys can read the bullet points on this, but I'll synthesize it. I've done a lot of work, and others have done a lot of work on issues such as gestation stalls, laying hen cages. I used to work in Michigan, as is alluded to, which is traditionally more of a dairy state. Now I'm in Kansas, traditionally a beef cattle state. I think most of us would agree that when it comes to the animal care, animal welfare discussion, the beef and dairy industries have not been under the same lens as the swine and egg industries so far. However, folks like myself have been trying to encourage folks in the beef and dairy industries not to take that as you're getting, you won't be under the lens in the future kind of point. But that also leads to the observation that we probably know less about beef and dairy cattle welfare issues. In particular, I think we know a lot less about the disconnect, or maybe the lack of a disconnect, but I'm going to guess disconnect, between the consuming public, the resident voting public, and producers in those industries. Okay, that's a background motivation for this particular project. My collaborators at K-State, Dan Thompson, and then at Michigan State, Chris Wolf and Jana Swanson. This is a multidisciplinary, for those of you that know those names, project just led by an economist. Just got started, 3-year project, started in January. To be frank, this is the first activity, right, that's part of this grant. We're just getting started. It was advertised in the agenda as your opportunity to engage. That is how I hope you see it. Here's a real crude 3-year outline of what we're doing. Basically, the first year, we're gathering a lot of info to improve year 2 activities. And in year 2, we're going to do national beef cattle producer, national dairy cattle producer, and national consumer surveys and experiments. And I won't belabor the details of that unless you want me to, but here in year 1, we're in year 1 of this project, we're doing several focus group type activities. And this is a, let's call it a tweak on a focus group for today's discussion, okay? But we're just trying to improve our activities in year 2, basically. And then finally, in year 3, we'll do all our write-up and analysis. And basically what Scott and I visited about is likely in year 3, whatever this project has concluded, I'll come back to NIA in some manner to bring those findings back to you, okay? So it's important to recognize we are just starting. I'm hoping to get some perceptions from this room. I don't expect them to be representative of the industry nor of consumers, but it will start the process, okay? And that's basically what's alluded to at the bottom of the slide. So before I go to the next one, how many of you use clickers? Okay. Sherry, can I help you? It looks like wonderful. While we're handing these out, and there's no problem with a bit of a delay, nobody should be intimidated. These are anonymous, so if you don't like something on here, one for everybody. One for everybody. I have no way of knowing who is who, and frankly, I don't care about individual responses. I'm just after kind of polling in general for the room. You'll see how this works. Those of you who haven't done it, it's interactive with PowerPoint, so after you answer a question, you're going to see the response. To further bait you to respond, I will know the total number of responses on each question. I won't know the individual ones that did not respond, but I always say up front that I have no problem with awkward silence. So do everybody around you a favor and answer the question, and we won't take too much time on each one of them. But you still need a clicker?
No, I got a question though. I'm going to have to leave early before you're done. No
worries. Yeah, as long as you leave the clicker in here, because it works kind of like a dog collar. If you're holding it when you leave, it shocks you. No, not really, but the university pays about $55 for each of those clickers, and I just assume you not leave with it. No, that's fine in this setting. I appreciate it. And I will, so I said it's anonymous, but I do have a random number assigned to each of these clickers. So frankly, sir, I will know that you left after question 4 on the day that we're done. That's fine. Okay, so has everybody got a clicker? All right. so let's start with a real basic question. This obviously is useful for me. Which species industry are you most involved with, most aligned with? You know, if you still...
How do you use them?
I'll tell you here.
Okay.
Very good. Okay. Everything I'm going to ask you is a multiple choice question. Okay. This one, for example, I've given you 7 choices. The 7th one would be an other. So if you align with multiple species and don't want to play your hand on which one, if you don't align with any of them, anything like that, just click the 7. To answer your question, ma'am, there's a number code, right, just like on your cell phone. I'm going to assume for a second you're associated with the beef cattle industry, make a point. You press a 1 on your clicker right now.
Mine says leave presentation vote yes or no. Mine's,
Let me see.
that's why I asked if it's not.
It's no problem.
It has a curve on.
You shouldn't have to turn it on. So now you can change your answer.
Got it, sent to you.
If anybody else is having issues, raise your hand. I'll walk to you. That's fine.
So not accepting my answer.
Well, I don't want to send you your hand. It also saves your last answer. So for those of you that I'm coming and messing with it, right, I'm just pushing 1 to make it work. When you push a number, it'll show on your screen. So again, I keep sticking with beef cattle as an example. If you push 1, maybe with the beef industry, it'll show a 1 on your screen. That tells you that it's done. Okay? I can see 42 of you have successfully pushed. I don't know how many are in here. Let's say 50, so that's roughly right. Any remaining issues, these all work the same. Once we get past 1 slide, it's pretty straightforward.
And the other is like multiple species, that's what you're saying.
Yeah, if it's multiple species or none.
Do you have to press yes?
No, you do not. Just push the number. So I have to make a side joke. When I use these in a general producer meeting, like if I go talk to the Kansas Livestock Association or somebody, I never get this many questions. I don't think they care as much, so that's fine. All right, so this is a, if you like, icebreaker type question. It's also important for me. So basically, a 4th of you answered beef cattle, a 4th swine industry, a 4th other. So we have a little bit of everybody in the room, if you like, right? 1 through 6, I attempted to look at the agenda to cover all, species, if you like. I recognize that there is a messy setting here. That's okay. That's just so I know who's in the room. Okay. It's important to recognize that I'm going to use ultimately year 2 survey responses to assess where the beef producer industry, right, and dairy cattle industry is in relation to consumers. Okay? And this is some examples, it's a subset, but of the types of things we'll be probing both producers and consumers on. So to answer this question, doesn't know if you've already started, what portion of beef cow calf operations in the U.S. have less than 100 cows? Each one of these portion questions, you'll have to sing for 25% increments, so you'll be comfortable with that for the sake of speed here. And if you don't know, you don't know. There's nothing wrong with that. If that's your honest answer, tell me that. That's fine.
Guessing is permitted, though, right?
I'm sorry?
Guessing is permitted.
It is. That's one of the benefits of anonymous and 45 responses, right? You can hide behind your guesses. And to be even more frank, that's one of the reasons I have multiple choice. I could have done these as fill in the blank, and you'd feel even worse if I guessed if it's 3% or 97, right? So I made it a little easier on everybody. All right, so 40%, say 51 to 75, 31, 76 to 100. If you use NAS data, the answer would be 90%. Okay, so the correct answer in NAS's eyes would be group 4. The 4% said they don't know, so be it. If you made me forecast what the responses to this would be from consuming public, it would be much more, how do I want to say this? They would think everybody has less than 100 cows. Right, kind of thing. They would not have a good handle on, the number that have 4,000, the small number of operations that have 4,000 cows. I don't think the public has a good handle on that, but that's yet to be explored, right? This isn't about size per se, it's that kind of general benchmarking to see how far apart the consuming public is from the industry that we're interested in. So stick with the beef industry for a second. What portion of beef produced in the U.S. do you believe comes from operations or production systems, just a general statement there, providing appropriate overall care? Now, obviously, there is not a quote-unquote correct answer, not a NAS statistic, right, to compare to here. This is a pure perception question for the audience. The concept of appropriate overall care is all in the eyes of the beholder, right? right, so 95% gave me number 4. Again, if you made me forecast, I don't think it'll be quite that as overwhelming when consumers respond to this. So now tell me what you think, okay? Same question, but now I want you to tell me what you think the public thinks, right, if you read this. So what portion of beef produced in the U.S. do you think the typical U.S. resident believes comes from production systems providing appropriate care? Okay, so most of you kind of agree with me that it'll be a smaller proportion, right? We'll see how that aligns in the future. Okay, let's switch to the dairy industry for a second. As I said, I have a few things about multiple species in here, just to kind of, wet everybody's whistle with this. What portion of milk produced in the U.S. do you believe comes from operations and production systems that regularly provide outdoor access? Or access to pasture for their cows?
Wait, I have a clarification. So do you
Yep.
mean outdoors, like they're in a dry lot, or do you mean outdoors and pasture?
I want to be careful here. You answer it the way you interpret the question. I'm not going to use this as pure benchmarking, but when I do an online survey of consumers, they're not going to be able to ask me that question. So I'm not going to answer yours until you respond.
Yeah, I see.
And to be honest, when somebody says they don't know, it could be because they don't know the question, or it could be because they don't know how to answer the question, so you can respond. Okay, so we're kind of all across the board here, right? The room is split. Of course, in the background, right? First question I asked you is what industry you're aligned with. I'm pretty sure if I cross-tab this, for those of you that came from the dairy industry, it'll be different than those of you that didn't, right? Those kind of things later. You probably have different bars when you do subsets of responses. Again, I don't expect the public to be the same, right? I think things like the happy cow video, right, that presents cows talking, walking across the pasture, right, present a different image to the average person in the public than producers typically have. Okay, so let's go to the pork industry. What portion of pork produced in the U.S. do you believe comes from operations and production systems using sow gestation stalls as of today? While you're responding to this one, I'll also add, when we're done, I have about 15 of these questions. I'm not going to make you do it for 45 minutes. I'm happy to talk about any of these or more broadly, things on beef, dairy, cattle welfare front you'd like to explore. I'm just trying to minimize some of the commentary as we go through these. Okay, 77% said the 76 to 100. The statistics on that vary. Somebody can argue with me, but the stats I've seen are 80 to 85% would be in that arena, so that would be in the group 4 here. Okay. What portion of U.S. residents do you believe would vote in favor of banning the use of sow gestation stalls throughout the U.S. swine industry? Percent say 51 to 75. About a third of you say the larger number. If I was to answer this, I would have also pushed number 3. When you observe the voting behavior in other states, for example, Prop 2, right, 63% voted in favor of Prop 2. You can pick different states to make your point, but they typically fall in that 51 to 75% range as the question was asked. What portion of total eggs sold in the U.S. do you think are cage-free eggs? Again, as of today. All right, 71% say 0 to 10. And a couple after that. The most recent statistic I've seen is less than 4%, 3% and change. Okay? That's just the number I have to share with you, which obviously would fit in group 1.
Wait, is there some mass data relative to that?
But let me be careful. My 4% one is a quote from UEP that I'm sharing. I don't know if there's a NAS equivalent one. I mean, UEP represents large enough of egg production. I'm comfortable with it. But And I'm particularly comfortable with being 0 to 10% range.
Yes.
But yeah.
I haven't seen any USDA data.
Yeah, to answer your question, I haven't narrowly seen that. So this is a little bit different question, right? But we're still talking about cage-free production. How much of a price premium do you think is currently paid for cage-free eggs in the U.S.? So I asked you basically about market share, and now I'm asking you what the average premium
To the
is.
producer or?
No, average paid by the consumer. And that's a fair point. Thank you for noting that. I should say by consumer. To be honest, I had all these questions about twice as long before I started interleaving them in PowerPoint. I have to shorten them to make it feasible to do things this way. That's a poor excuse for the question that came up, but in the mail and online versions, each of these questions will be a little bit longer, probably. All right, so all across the board. The one thing I could share, and I can forward you a link to the study if somebody wants it, there's a study done in Oklahoma State that was crunching actual scanner data, so actual egg consumption data, and the estimated premium for cage-free eggs of the minority that represented was 57%. Okay, so that would fit in group 3 here, but that's close enough that I can see why group 2, right, got a little bit smaller. Okay. Sidebar here, there's an important distinction between mean and median, right? Average willingness to pay is 57% of that example, right? Median being the 50th percentile of the population. The vast majority of the public isn't paying that, right? As evidenced by the roughly 4% market share of free eggs. Okay, that doesn't mean the issue isn't important, but recognizing that distinction between mean willingness to pay and median people willing to do it, right, is an important one, and it's not unique to the cage-free discussion. What portion of U.S. residents do you believe would vote in favor of banning the use of battery cages throughout the U.S. egg-laying hen industry? Somewhat similar to last time, right, when I asked you equivalent on gestation stalls. To date, the voting pattern has been very similar, right, when those two issues have come to vote. They're intertwined also in cases like Prop 2, where they're in the same ballot, of course. But, so number 3, 51.75%, that's the same response I would have gave because it matches the examples we have of voting behavior today. Okay. So my last few questions are going to be a little bit harder, but that's okay because I've warmed you up how the clickers work. And you'll have to read a little bit more, but that's okay. Which of the following do you believe presents the best option or strategy? There's a reason I've underlined that to highlight that. Given the current discussions regarding animal welfare issues in your industry. Okay? And this is not a all-exclusive list, so others at the bottom. But in case you can't read in the back, I'll read them to you. Number 1 is maintain the status quo, right? Do what we're doing today kind of response. Number 2, actively negotiate with concerned groups. Number 3, actively seek additional legislation or regulation. Number 4, support retail labeling to convey animal welfare information. Number 5, support phasing out existing facilities using debated production practices. And number 6, other. Again, you can use other if you think more than one of these is part of the strategy. If you don't want to say which is best, I mean, others have messed in response here. But while you're responding to that, I recognize it's not an all-exclusive list. When I've given talks with producer groups that are facing pressure in their states, I've walked through, as I see it, the options on the table, and these are, part of that list. So I'm curious what the room thinks of this. And again, it says for your industry. So later, what I'm going to do is cross-tab this with the first question, right? How are responses to this different if I know you come from the egg industry versus dairy cattle industry and so forth? Yes, go ahead.
I don't know if you can answer this or not. Maybe it's up to us to interpret, but by concerned groups, do you mean like concerned consumers or activist groups? Or is that up to us?
Anybody that's concerned with current practices in your industry, which would be multiple types of groups, right? Yeah. Because yes, I understand how you might want to quote unquote negotiate with some and not others, and I've looked, I've grouped them into one here just for simplicity. In this, yes, sir.
Can number 4 be interpreted as let the market decide, or?
That's not what I had in mind, at least. It's a good question, though. Because let me give it to you this way. If I would have said support mandatory retail labeling, that would change that in your eyes, right? Because that's not, quote unquote, letting the market decide the same, right? So, or support additional labeling might be a better way to think of it, because to date the market has decided, right, if you like, how much labeling there is on these issues. For those of you who don't know, I'm very much a free market economist. We can talk about that when we're done. But this list could have been, 20 long, right? So I recognize that none of these are perfect. And I appreciate these comments because they will lead me to tweaking the question going forward. Frankly, that's the main purpose of this section. All right, so 44% say other because they don't like the question. No, so let's pause here. There's a comment in the back, and then I'll ask you to speak up. Yeah.
Okay. Should we be looking at this as far as a question being asked to a consumer or to industry?
You believe as a stakeholder in your industry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, main problem with what your answers of their selection is there's nothing proactive in your selection.
Define proactive. So I'm going to disagree with that assertion a little bit.
To me, they're all defensive moves.
Okay. Well, maintain the status quo, I submit, is definitely not proactive. That's the do-nothing approach, right? Actively negotiate, actively seek additional legislation, support additional labeling if you allow that tweak. Those all could be considered proactive compared to what we're doing today. Now, are they proactive enough, which is where I think your question's going, right? If there are other stuff that can be done that's not on here, that's a fair point. And anybody's thinking of that probably gave you the other answer, I'm guessing, right?
I would say maintain the status quo is a proactive approach. If your industry is proactively explaining to the consumer and public what we're doing,
right.
And I see that as the only proactive answer on it.
Yeah. And that is fine. This is, it doesn't surprise me there's a mix here. And quite frankly, I expect even more diverse set, in other settings when I ask this. But Julie had a question.
Well, I guess my comment is similar to the previous, that there's nothing that says do what Illinois Farm Bureau is doing.
Right.
That captured that,
right.
That the farmers need to be a voice to what they're doing and explain why they're doing it. That would add.
Yeah, but let's go further with that. And these are all fair points. In reality, when I implement this, I'm not going to have a 40 answer choice, but I will have a other please describe, right? I can't do this in the sake of this technology. I would hope that at least those that are truly passionate about this, 44% of you said other, half of you would give me a comment that told me why you said other, so I would learn more in that setting. But even on the Illinois Farm Bureau one, right, you can break that into 4 or 5 different approaches, right? Yes.
Just a comment on number 4, I think, from our viewpoint, it would be who gets to determine what the terminology is on that labeling. I mean, if you mainly raised means milk crates or everything has to be in pasture or whatever, that's
sure. Well,
different.
And likewise, number 5, the support phasing out, right? If I'm a producer in the industry, I might support that notion, but it's going to be very sensitive to the timetable of that phasing out, right? So there's a lot of details under each one of these, and I appreciate that fully. Yeah.
When you do a question like this online, I would suggest having the option of people to actually rank these rather than take an absolute, because you may be able to tease out a little more information by the different rankings that people do.
Yeah, so
particularly at the consumer side.
So a sidebar, since you brought that up, and I think you all are with me enough on the project concept enough to let's go methods for a moment. Number 1, when you do online surveys, it's easy to randomize lots of stuff. So the same type of question, I'm not going to just show them an updated version of this. Consumers are going to randomly get the same thing updated, and then the same thing without 2 of these choices, the same thing without 3 of these choices, so I can back out how, right, the choice set influences their response, and also I'll allow more robust, multiple options, type in your comments, so forth. But to be, we all know surveys are not perfect, right? At the end of the day, you just have to get it, the best you can, and hopefully all this will improve it. Other comments on this one? And we can come back to it. When we're done, I can come back to all these and show you your responses if you want. But yes?
I would just add, I think you mentioned this, but I think that having an option to type in your comments on Tether would be really valuable, just because it's going to be impossible to give enough detail online on each of those options, and so it might be interesting to see what producers actually do want.
Yeah.
And that might give them a chance to define the more proactive approach. My guess is that most producers want to be proactive, but I don't really like these proactive choices.
Yeah, and I'll use that as the first green light for my begging, right? Year 2, we're going to do a lot of these surveys. I haven't lined up to work with NAS to do it, But I fully encourage those of you in the room that come from commodity X and state Y that would like to partner, right, in this effort. In particular, if you want to send out a letter to your state saying do this survey and tweak it along those lines for issues that might be unique to your state, right, go further with me, elaborate on another point, contact me and we can figure that kind of stuff out. This project won't operate in silo. And even I have other projects that are related to this. We might as well tackle other issues with it too. Yes.
You might want to do two different questions. This is basically either do nothing or everything else is a concession. And then do a second one, which would provide some options of education and information and dissemination, which might be of interest to some consumers. Right now, what's going on, as well as producers who want to do something besides sit on their hands or just give up.
Right. I agree entirely with that. And I'm not bringing it up today, but along those lines, we're also going to infuse timeline of returns on investment in the producer survey in particular. So the value of trying to educate the public, right? I'm fully on board with Jim's presentation being part of the tool set of response, but I don't think you're going to, personally, I'm speaking now, I don't think you're going to move the needle on voting behavior in the next year with that. I think that's a longer term investment, right? And understand the timetable on the industry's activities, and it's important. So break it two ways and then bring in the time dimensions for that. Okay, so let's progress here. I'm almost done. But I do have three more difficult ones. How likely are new or expanded national standards regarding livestock housing practices, so that's a subset, of course, of care and welfare, to be implemented in the U.S. for your industry within the next 10 years? And this is just a generic likely scale from very likely number 1 to very unlikely number 5. Of course, one would expect if you gave me a maintain the status quo response to the previous question, you're going to have a different response to this than if you gave me a different answer. Right? Those kind of things you'd expect to see. Yes, sir.
Are you talking in legislative form, or are you talking in negotiations?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. No, even that's a standard of doing business, if you like, which can be generated either way. Right? Yeah. The trigger points are definitely different there. I understand. So across the board, I played my hand here. If I cross-tab this by species, I think it won't be uniform anymore, right? Frankly, at the risk of offending that egg producer in the room, I expect egg producers, given discussion there, to be at a different point in this discussion than, say, equine, right? For those of you that responded differently in the first question. So this is another broad one. How do you think animal welfare concerns facing your industry, right, given how you responded in the first question, compared to those faced by other species-delineated industries? Number 1, my industry is facing less concern. Number 2, about the same. Number 3, more concerns.
Let me ask you a question. You say these are anonymous, but can you tie this question back to the first question?
Yeah. There's a serial number on this clicker.
Which is good.
I don't know you, but I know that clicker gave me these 15
But I mean,
answers.
you can make something out of, if you answer one that you're...
Yeah. This question is worthless to me. I can't do that. Yeah. But to be fair, I'm not going to do a lot of that with this study because I'm going to use a version of this 5 or 6 times. Yeah. People use these in undergrad classrooms a lot to do quizzes, right? And I have to be able to connect this with your grade, if that makes sense. In that case, it's no longer anonymous, but the ability to crunch the data, as you say. Okay? So across the board responses. All right. So I have a sequence of 3 questions here. Right? They're the same question except for one minor difference in the top. Okay? And I'll walk you through this. Given current practices listed below, again, it's not an exhaustive list, what do you believe is the most effective, whatever most effective means to you before you ask me that question, option to improve the welfare of livestock in your industry? Point 1, requiring regular access to the outdoors. 2, prohibiting tail docking removal. 3, prohibiting use of antibiotics, growth hormones. 4, prohibiting use of stalls or cages. 5, requiring anesthesia prior to surgical procedures. 6, requiring use of certified transport, or the favorable number 7, other. Okay. Background for this, those 6 are among the things across species are getting lots of discussion, right? Within each species you can add points. In an effort to generate a multi-species question, this is what Janice Swanson in particular came up with. Just clarification.
The cages need clarifying. Conventional cage, colony cage, enriched colony cage. What kind of cage? should we prohibit the use of?
Cages, period, when you respond to this.
It's about perception or reality.
Well,
I mean,
I can't hold back and say perception is reality in the voting public, consuming public, but to answer your question, Ron, I know there's a big difference on the type of cage and so forth, but when you pose the question, would you vote to ban use of stalls, we don't talk about what kind of stall, usually. Or would you ban the use of waiting cages? We don't talk about, normally narrow detail on the space within that cage, right? So respond to it in a broader sense. Those details obviously come up in negotiation. Yes, Ernie?
Did you give any thought to having an option on here of properly trained and educated employees?
Yes. I did, and I dropped it. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter. If that's your response. I told you I trimmed these back. I had 15 responses, and that's the one I took off in order to implement this today. To my comment on the national survey, we'll have various versions of these questions, because I can't ask somebody to do multiple choice out of 15. That's silly. I will do that full set, and each person will randomly get a subset of those, where some people will have that as a choice out of them all. And at the end of the day, all the responses I can use, right, to see how prevalent the issue of training your employees is as a most effective option.
Yeah, and I might suggest from an industry standpoint that maybe where we have the best opportunity to make improvements is in that area.
It may well be. Right. It's certainly one of the things you might have a little more control over than other things. Right? You at least need to keep that in mind. Okay, so that was the first version of 3 of these in a row. Okay, 47% said other. I'm going to assume it's for reasons like we talked about earlier. Others the catch-all category here. Okay, we'll come back to this in a second. This is the same question, but now instead of most effective, it's what do you believe of those options would result in the largest, most positive consumer response. So it's actually what's most effective. Now I'm asking you, what of that same set of choices for its own, it's a limited set, I understand, would result in the largest, most positive consumer response. Okay, so there's a view in the room by a third of you. The public wants more outdoor access. Right? That's implicit in those of you that said number 1. 3 and 4, antibiotics, use of stalls and cages, also notable responses there. Okay. Point number 1 is I think we all understand why there's a difference in your response to this question than the previous one. Right? I don't need to belabor that. This is the third one in that series. Okay. Which of those same options do you think would result in the largest increase in production cost? So I asked you what's the most effective option. I asked you what the consumer will most favorably respond to. Right? Now on the supply and cost of doing business side of things, which of that same exact set would have the largest increase in production cost?
Change that to food cost.
Yeah.
It's going to be
Well, actually,
consumer.
well, and we got to be careful. These options vary in the extent to which they are fixed cost adjustments versus variable cost adjustments, and the fact that those 2 percentages are not the same on these options changes the proportion of when it gets to the consumer, right? The timeline of those impacts. So actually, if I was crunching this, you'd get slightly different cost impacts to the consumer than you would on the farm production cost, depending on which option you're talking about. Yeah. But the general notion, yes, it passes through. Okay, so fairly similar, right? Those of you that responded, right, 31% was the previous response for the public would respond favorably to outdoor access. 32% of you also think that's the most expensive thing, right, to offer from this set. Okay? I submit to you that's probably one of the reasons that it isn't more prevalent, right? At least the perception is it's more expensive than it might be worth. Right? Free market economists, I think that's kind of revealed.
It would be much more significant depending on the industry that you're,
sure.
You're involved in too.
Right, and in a multi-species meeting that I fully understand, but right, when I crunch this based on your responses to Q1, it'll be different. Okay. So I think I have 2 questions left. What portion of U.S. residents do you believe would vote in favor of mandatory labeling, so this gets to Ernie's question a little bit earlier, of livestock housing practices on retail meat, milk, and egg products? All right, 49%, 51 to 75. To date, such a thing has not been voted on. The reason it's up here, right, is the UEP-HSUS agreement, right, is calling for a number of things, including additional labeling on retail egg products that might make this an issue coming forward. Narrowly, Chris Wolf and I, one of my collaborators here, did a study to analyze, in the case of stall use on retail pork products, used pork chops, in the case of eggs, right, would you vote in favor of mandatory labeling to know whether or not those practices were used, and you get that same roughly 2/3 of support, okay? Now, don't misunderstand that to say I think the consumer will voluntarily pay a premium for it, but that does mean that I think they would vote for it, and those are 2 different points that are important to recognize. Yes.
I will share with you, and I think it came out in the HSUS, that survey said 80% voted in favor of the HSUS.
80% of the public would be in favor of it? Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I mean, personal opinion, if it went to vote, I think the average, voter would be in favor of that agreement. So I would believe the poll will make
80% of the Ohio voting public.
80% of the Ohio voting public? That's who they surveyed that?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, I believe this is my last question. Are you in favor of laws prohibiting photographs or videos to be taken on farms without permission? Yes, I'm in favor of these laws. Number 1. 2, no, I'm opposed to these laws. Or 3, I don't know. Okay, a little over half in favor. Not everybody is. 14% don't know. Of course, the motivation for this is what's going on in Utah and Iowa, right? 2 states that, going forward with these kind of laws. There's discussions in other states, and as revealed here, there's some support, but not everybody is in favor of it, right? Another contentious part of the animal care discussion that isn't going away. That's it. If I ask the public this, I expect them to be more in favor. I expect them to be opposed to it, right? Opposed to these new laws, because they're going to see it as a defensive kind of issue. Yes, sir.
When did you think about when you raised the question undercover?
Yes, thank you.
Because there are a lot of times from an ag standpoint, and I'll relate to the media side, so maybe driving down the road and thinking about whether it's a great farm shot and just snap it, somebody else's field without getting that person's permission, which is completely different than the intent of what some of the animal actors are saying.
Yeah, fair point. I'm not aware, but the stuff I've seen that's been discussed in Utah and Iowa has the phrase without permission in it. That's what drove this. I do agree with you that if it was phrased undercover, that might tweak the responses. Hopefully you're all picking up on the fact that things are sensitive to how you phrase it. This is step 1 in 10 steps to try to improve the question, but it's never going to get perfect. I do think it's sensitive whether undercover is used in the wording. Yeah.
I'm not sure what you're trying to identify here, but my point is that you probably need to ask a second question. Even though I may support this in favor of it, am I actively going to lobby or try to get it in place? I think you get 2 different answers on that. I may support it, but I am not going to go out there and be physical trying to pass the law and make this happen.
Support point, yeah. And it makes sense, right? It's easier to vote anonymously than to have your face in front of the camera lobbying more. And changing the liability story and the whole 9 yards that come with that. Understood. Okay, so I'll take questions in a second, but this is a update. This is the first year and 3-year project. You guys will get this, NIA is going to have this presentation with all those bars, right? This PowerPoint will say your responses. Right? So you'll be able to see that later. But more generally, K-State has a agmanager.info website, some of you may or may not be familiar with. I post every presentation I ever give in PDF form to this website. And narrowly, there's a section called Animal Wellbeing and Welfare. I only note this because I opened the door earlier on the video impacts as it relates to farmers' fetus and so forth. There's a study on here with a fact sheet about that. Those kind of things you can find on this website if you want more information. Or if you email me, I'm likely to send you a link to this that says click on this title point on this page, if that's useful. So with that, Jim, I accomplished most of my mission, but I'm happy to take further comments, suggestions. Before I totally open it up, I was being sincere when I said, if you want to actively be involved in this project, by all means contact me or the other collaborators I noted. I think that kind of stuff is important. I think as an economist, it's one of my roles, hopefully, to add information to this discussion. I often assert that pressure for change on the animal welfare front is moving way ahead of lots of research questions that have not been answered. And regardless if you're in favor of or against some of the changes, as an economist, I need to see decisions made without full information. So one of the general goals of these kinds of projects is to add to that information. So if you're interested in helping me with that, by all means, contact me. No, you're okay. I took 10 for 10. You go ahead.
My question is, think carefully about putting these answers up for the general public without the context.
Go further. Do you want it censored from the NIA's website? That's not my call. But we're in that meeting, so somebody else. And I will also tell you up front that I will not censor it since I work at a university going forward. I will today because we're in this meeting if there's a general consensus. But the purpose of the grant is to identify gaps, right, between the producer and consumer. And I'm not going to shy away from gaps or common points.
All I'm saying is that without a context for how those questions were asked and the makeup of the population, they may be misconstrued.
No, that's a fair point. But I'm not going to live the cake, right? Hopefully you understand why I'm responding, because every study is misconstrued, period, right? Period. That's the reality on it. I'm not going to put the raw data for this out, because I think that would be even more dangerous, right? So you'll just get summary stats if you like, right? In this particular case, you'll be able to read the 47% answer number 3 on a multiple choice question, right? Can it be taken out of context? Yes. Right? I'll leave it to Scott, if there's a general concern on that for this meeting, we can visit on that. But I will tell you, frankly, because of how USDA is paying for this, the other activities of this grant, they're going to get put it on the website. Right or wrong.
Could you explain again the objectives, specific objectives for this project? You did just a minute ago generally.
Yeah.
Describe the gaps and then what?
And then what? Do a lot more work. Yeah, no, I'll go back to this just so somebody can read one on it. It's motivated by the fact there's been a lot less done in the beef and dairy cattle industries on identifying how far apart producers and consumers are. That's the main goal, is to start to fill that gap. Start to is a key part of it. I'm not going to get down to one study. Okay? So an example I used talking to the board 2 days ago was, I think we all would expect, right, talk about the dairy industry, for example, the public might be more concerned about tail docking than producers are. I think we expect that, right? We also probably expect the public's a little more concerned about outdoor access issues than producers are. But what we don't know is the relative gap in those two, which one's a bigger gap? You follow me? So, and that's just 2 examples of a host of attributes or practices that we're talking about here. What we're hoping to gain is some kind of insights on ranking the gaps, right? And that in turn will guide what's next. Okay? So let's just continue that example. If tail docking is somewhere where there's the biggest gap, that will call for more work on why is that gap there, how effective are things like Jim's project in dealing with, right, the tail docking issue and so forth. We'll have, I'd expect, narrower studies on individual industries, individual practices. This is a much broader, it will kind of start the process study. It's not a narrow benefit cost answer on any of those things, which is probably where you're leading up to on what's next.
Sort of, but it's, I guess what I'm seeing kind of picture is that this is really to find those gaps and to determine how better to communicate with the public rather than research to determine whether practice X is value.
Any value in a pure or scientific.
Yeah, production efficiency or.
Yeah, no, we are not having that at all, right, in this particular project. That's by no means my expertise to touch. But if you do find gaps, right, that will beg for some of that work we've done as already, right? And any work that's been done on sticking my tail by example, right, would come into that narrower assessment, right, of how to respond to that gap. Now, I think it's also important to think of the opposite here, is you're not going to find gaps on everything that is the same. There might be some common points where producers and consumers are relatively equally concerned, right? I think that leads to opportunity, hence the title Opportunity Threat in the grant, for talking points, maybe things that producers can talk about more, right? And while the door's closed, basically buy time to figuring out ways to deal with the threat issues, right? I think that's part of the, let's identify those things to identify what's next. It's just the first of a multi-step process. Yeah. But hopefully identify which issues to talk about in those communications instead of the dairy industry does get more. I mean, those kind of broad stuff was breaking down. Yeah. Yes.
First of all, I'll come out and say, well, Ohio, we'll help you with this and help you know what we need to do. But the second question, you're going to regionalize your answers, maybe geographically.
I will know. We're going to do that. You can cut me off whenever you want. Okay. Nationally representative beef cattle, dairy cattle, and consumer surveys and some in-person experience for the same groups. Nationally representative being 11 to 12% will be from California, right? Less than 2% Kansas. So I will test for state effects and everything I do later, right? I'll know, right? For those of you in the room from less populated states, Kansas and so forth, I never promise that I'm going to tell you how your state is different than others, because even if something nationally representative, I have a small sample in certain states. So I'm not comfortable saying that Kansas is particularly unique. You know, forewarning, I'll cut that question off before it comes. But we will control for some regional impacts. You know, the GDP of ag in the state, right, how prevalent it is, those kind of things are things I typically